Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into episode 3 of the Unbreakable Table series. And this one, it's a little different. We're looking at what happens when an absolute, unchanging foundation meets something totally unpredictable, a living, fluid ecosystem. We're not just talking about inanimate objects anymore. We're putting something alive, highly fluid, and constantly moving right on top of a surface that literally refuses to yield. The table stands silent, just like always. It doesn't boast, it doesn't warn. But today, it faces an absolutely incredible physical test.
As the source material perfectly points out, water is incredibly deceptive. I mean, an aquarium looks completely serene, right? But think about it. It's filled to the absolute brim. You've got gallons of water pressing outward, light bending, bubbles rising in this quiet, steady rhythm. It looks perfectly calm, but that calmness is a total illusion. If you've ever tried to carry a full fish tank, you know exactly what I mean. Water is uniquely difficult to stabilize because its weight is never, ever still. So let's jump right into section 1, the living challenge.
If you remember episode 1, we tested sheer simplicity. Episode 2 was all about pushing the limits of pure mass. But episode 3, this takes us into totally uncharted territory. We're testing life itself. Can a moving, breathing environment actually be supported by a surface that refuses to adapt? That's the core mystery we're unpacking today.
And the physical stakes here are absolutely massive. Depending on the size, a full aquarium presses downward with hundreds of kilograms of relentless, shifting weight. Most tables under this kind of dynamic strain would groan, right? Some would visibly bend. A lot of them would just flat out fail altogether. Water doesn't just sit there. It actively, constantly tests whatever is holding it up. But of course, this is the unbreakable table. Which brings us to section 2, pure, silent contact. We can track the deliberate methodology of this test through 4 escalating steps. It starts with the quiet, careful placement of the tank onto the table. Next, they introduce vibration. Then they add more water to push the physical limits. And finally, they actually shift the equilibrium. Every single step is incredibly measured and intentional. Let's look at that first step. As the massive aquarium is lowered and the base meets the surface, time kind of seems to stretch. The water inside trembles from the movement, but the table, it does not bend. It is just pure, silent contact. It doesn't shake either. You would totally expect a loud crack or at least a groan when hundreds of kilos of water make contact, but there's nothing. Zero. The fish dart around, the plants sway, but the foundation underneath remains completely undisturbed. It simply holds. It doesn't even seem to acknowledge the immense weight that was just dropped on it. No stress lines, no hesitation. It just sits there, setting the stage for an absolutely profound experiment in physics and durability. You know, it's this beautiful contrast. On one side, you have the aquarium. It represents total fragility with its glass walls and delicate life, constantly dynamic and unpredictable. On the other side, the table. Absolute durability, complete indifference to pressure, entirely unchanging. Yet, they coexist perfectly right here. It's a brilliant illustration of an engineering tension, balancing absolute fragility with unyielding, indifferent strength. Moving on to section 3, introducing chaos and weight. Okay, so here's where things get wild. What happens when this fragile balance gets actively disturbed? They introduce a controlled, subtle vibration to agitate the water. Instantly, the environment responds. Ripples form, waves collide against the glass, the fish scatter and regroup. The whole tank becomes completely dynamic. But look at the table. It actively isolates the chaos. No movement transfers down into it, and no instability rises back up. It contains all the unpredictability above without actually participating in it. This isn't just about strength, it's about absolute control. And that leads us to a really fascinating takeaway about the table's design: conceptual unbreakability. For anyone interested in design or engineering, this is huge. True unbreakability isn't just about resisting physical force, it's the ability to ignore it completely. Seriously, the table does not negotiate with weight. Even as the challenge escalates and more water is slowly, carefully added, pushing the surface tension right to the gleaming edge of the glass, the table simply refuses to adapt or struggle. Every single drop adds demand, but the table acts like the concept of too much just doesn't exist in its universe. This takes us to section 4, a balance of opposites. To really highlight this dynamic visually, the researchers dim the lights. It's totally mesmerizing.
The vulnerable illuminated aquarium glows, turning the fish into tiny silhouettes, while the table completely fades into the shadows below. It becomes unseen but absolutely essential. Without the table, this glowing ecosystem is entirely vulnerable, and without the aquarium, the table remains untested. Together, they create a scene that is incredibly peaceful, yet intensely demanding.
As the explainer so beautifully puts it, this episode is not about destruction, it is about trust. At the end of the day, the survival of this heavy, delicate little world relies entirely on trust. Trust that the aquarium glass will remain intact, and absolute trust that the foundation beneath it will not fail under the immense shifting pressure.
And now, our final section, the ultimate question.
Now, this is the climax of the test. They don't just stop at adding weight. They actively challenge the physical equilibrium itself. They tilt the massive aquarium just slightly, not enough to tip it over, but enough to dramatically shift the internal center of gravity. The water tilts, the fish have to quickly adjust, and the table? It remains entirely unmoved. It doesn't compensate for the imbalance at all. It proves it literally doesn't care where the weight leans, only that the weight exists. Finally, the test concludes, the water settles into stillness, and the physical evidence is completely clear. No cracks, no strain, no bending, no warping, absolutely no microscopic signs of a struggle recorded in the material. There is only presence. Untouched, unchanged, looking exactly like it did at the very beginning of the experiment. It has acted as the perfect, silent anchor to a deeply moving and chaotic world. Which leaves us to ponder one massive, lingering mystery. If something can effortlessly hold the shifting weight of a living world without breaking, what else can it hold? The unbreakable table remains silent, quietly waiting for its next challenge. Thanks for hanging out with us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.